He inherited a ghost town for $75. $9 widows were still cooking breakfast inside. I never told this story right. I started it a dozen times, to a barkeep in Laramie, to my cousin Dill who never believed a word I said anyway, once to a circuit preacher who fell asleep mid-telling, and I always started it wrong. I always started with the price. $75. That's what I paid for the whole of Creed's Crossing, Montana territory in the autumn of 1887. Deed, buildings, well, 3 outbuildings, whatever was inside them. $75, cash, from a lawyer's estate sale in Billings who didn't know and didn't care what he was selling. The price is a good detail, but it's the wrong door in. The right door is the morning I rode up the main street, if you could call it that. It was more of a suggestion, one rut deeper than the other, false fronts on one side canting like old men and smelled bacon. I want to be accurate about what I expected. I'd bought the place sight unseen off a hand-drawn map and 2 paragraphs in a probate ledger. The lawyer who sold it to me, a thin man named Hobbs with ink-stained cuffs and the permanent expression of a man eating something sour, said, "Former mining supply depot, abandoned post 84 when the vein ran out. 12 structures, well-reported sound, some personal effects still on premises." He paused like he was deciding something and then decided against saying it. "Motivated sale," he said instead. I was 41 years old. I had $412 total in the world, a horse named Wick who had strong opinions about mornings, and a record of decisions that could charitably be described as varied. 6 years trail driving north from Texas. Before that, 2 years failed farming in Nebraska where the soil was good and the weather had its own plans. Before that, a war I don't go into much because going into it doesn't improve anything. I was not a man who'd accumulated things. I'd accumulated distance. I was good at distance, the starting of it, the managing of it, the way it fills up the parts of you that might otherwise ask for more than distance. $75 for 12 structures and a water source. I figured I'd winter there, assess what I had, sell off timber from the worst of the outbuildings in spring, maybe find a buyer for the land itself if the survey turned up anything worth having. That was the full extent of my plan, not nothing but close. So, bacon. I pulled Wick up at the edge of what the map called Foundry Street. One side had a collapsed false front leaning against the building behind it. The other had what looked like a general store with oilcloth in the windows, and I smelled it. Wood smoke and bacon fat and something sweet underneath, something baked. Biscuits, maybe, or cornbread. The particular smell of actual food cooking in an actual kitchen. Wick moved his ears around independently, which he did when he found something interesting. "I see it too," I told him. There was smoke from 3 separate chimneys. 3, on a property the probate ledger had called abandoned. The first woman I saw was standing in the doorway of the old assay office, which I would learn she'd converted to a bakery without asking anyone's permission, including the original Assyers, who had been dead for 3 years. Her name was Hattie Crane. She was 68 years old, 4'11", built like someone had decided to make a woman out of hickory and good sense. She was looking at me the way you look at whether you haven't decided about yet. "You'd be the new owner," she said. It wasn't a question. "I would," I said. "Ilias Creed's nephew's estate. Cousin twice removed." She turned that over, looked at me again. "Well," she said, "come eat something, you look like you rode hard." I had ridden hard. 3 days from Billings, the last day in rain that couldn't decide between rain and sleet and split the difference badly. I was wet to the collarbone, cold in the deep way that gets past irritable into something quieter and flatter, and I was standing in what I had legally purchased and was not prepared for it to have inhabitants, smoke, or a smell like that. "How many of you are there?" I said. "9, said Hattie Crane. Wick made a sound that might have been comment. "Widows," she added, as though that settled the relevant question. "We were all of us here before the men left or died. Seemed foolish to go when we had roofs and a working well, so we didn't." I sat with that for a moment. The cold came off my wet coat in waves. The smell of bacon was very specific and very close. I got off my horse. I'll tell you their names because they matter, and because I still say them sometimes in order, the way you'd say the names of men you served alongside. The names and what they do, not what their husbands did, what they themselves do, because that's the accurate version. Hattie Crane, 68, the baker. Lost her husband Amos to the mine collapse of 1884, the one that ended the productive life of the place. 4'11" and would, I became convinced over time, argue with God about the recipe for biscuits and make a credible case. She had converted the assay office because it had the largest hearth in town outside the forge, and in the mornings it was where most of us ended up without exactly deciding to. Ruth Sable, 54, the one who kept the accounts. Her husband had been the company clerk and she had done his actual work for 12 years without credit, which is a common enough arrangement, and not one she seemed to hold against the memory of him, though she didn't speak about it either. When he died, she simply kept doing what she'd been doing, for her own purposes, in a ledger she maintained tracking the town's internal exchange of goods and labor. She had, without apparent plan or announcement, invented an economy. The ledger was immaculate. Pearl Mackenzie, 71. Scottish, born in Aberdeenshire, arrived in Montana via a sequence of events she was willing to describe, but that never quite added up to a coherent story. Something involving a ship, a cousin in Minnesota, and a man she'd married in 1849 and buried in 1876. She kept goats. There were goats. Nobody had mentioned goats in the probate ledger. There were 4 of them, and they had names and opinions, and Pearl treated their opinions with more respect than she treated most human opinions, including mine. Dorothy Vasquez, called Dot by everyone, 49. Her husband had been the blacksmith. She had spent 10 years watching him work and in that time accumulated enough knowledge to handle basic iron herself. Hinges, repairs, simple tool maintenance. The forge had been cold since '85, but the equipment was intact because Dot had kept it that way. She was not a woman who let things go to ruin. Nora Ellen Beck, 62. A former schoolteacher from Clermont County, Ohio, who'd come west with her husband for reasons she described without resentment as his reasons, not mine. He'd died of a thrown horse outside of Miles City in 1882 before they'd even reached Creed's Crossing. She'd continued on because going back seemed like a longer trip than going forward. She maintained a classroom in the back rooms of the old company offices. 4 children attended, not hers. She had no children, but she taught them with the cheerful authority of someone who'd found her purpose entirely independent of whether anyone had asked for it. Vera Polk, 57. I have been trying to find the right sentence for Vera since the first week I was there, and I still don't have it. She had chickens. She had a rifle. She had an expression that communicated before you'd opened your mouth that whatever you were about to say had better be worth saying. Her husband had been the sheriff. Vera had been, by general acknowledgement including that of the sheriff himself, the more useful of the two in any practical situation. She occupied the old sheriff's office, which she used for storage and slept in on nights when she felt like it. And she had a habit of appearing in the right place at the right moment that I came to trust completely without ever understanding how it worked. Agnes Beaumont, 66. She'd run the boarding house when there was a boarding house population to run it for, and she still ran it, for the 9 remaining residents and now for me. She cooked the kind of meals that made you revise your understanding of what food was for. Not fancy, there was nothing fancy about it, but right in some essential way. The way that a thing is right when the person making it knows exactly what it needs to be and has the skill to make it that way. She fed us the way some people love people, without sentiment, reliably, with complete attention to what was actually needed. Claire Toussaint, 47, originally from New Orleans, which you could hear if you listened. She was a healer, not a doctor, which she was precise about specifying, not because she was modest, but because she meant it as a distinction about method rather than ability. She knew what plants did what and how to combine them, and how to make a sick person feel that someone was paying close attention, which is more of the medicine than people generally account for. She had a room in the back of the boarding house that smelled of dried things and was always partly dim, and that I found oddly settling the times I went in there. And Margaret Hollies, 52. She'd been the wife of the mine superintendent, the actual running superintendent, not the owner who came from St. Paul once a year to look at the numbers, but the man who kept the operation in daily operation. Her husband had died not in the '84 collapse, but the previous winter of pneumonia, quiet in a bed. She said only once, that it was worse in some ways than the collapse deaths because it was slower and you understood what was happening. She didn't say it in a way that asked for anything. She said it in the way a carpenter will note that a particular joint is harder than it looks. Accurate, moving on. Margaret was the one who told the others to stay. When the company pulled out, when the last families began loading wagons, when the working men who weren't dead drifted toward Butte or Helena looking for the next vein, Margaret had called a meeting in Agnes's boarding house and made the case plainly. They had roofs, a working well, what provisions they could collectively pool, and the knowledge, she counted off their knowledge the way Ruth Sable counted ledger entries, to manage. Why leave? 7 of the 9 had agreed with her on the spot. The other 2 had intended to leave and then didn't quite get around to it, which is also a form of decision. She was the one who came out of the boarding house on my first morning, while I was eating Hattie's bacon and cornbread, and trying to understand what I'd bought, and stood in the doorway and looked at me the way you'd look at a piece of furniture someone had delivered before you'd decided where to put it. "How long are you planning to stay?" she said. "I own the place," I said. "I know that," I asked how long. I looked around at the 12 structures, 3 chimneys going, Pearl's goats watching Wick with the fixed interest of animals who have made their opinion of horses and are prepared to defend it. "I don't know yet," I told her. "Honest answer," she said. "Eat your breakfast." She went back inside. I ate my breakfast. I thought about the pump, which I'd heard making a sound I didn't like when Agnes drew water that morning. I want to tell this straight, which means I have to tell you what I was thinking when I arrived and how long it took me to stop thinking it. What I arrived thinking was this: I'll make an arrangement, something fair. They can stay through the winter. I was not going to put 9 women out in October in Montana. That's not something I was going to do regardless of the paperwork. And through the spring, probably, and I'd figure out what the land was worth, what I could do with it or sell off from it. We'd part amicably. They'd been squatting, technically, though I was not a man who put much weight on, technically. When it ran up against 9 women who'd been keeping a place from falling apart for 3 years without anyone asking them to. The arrangement that actually occurred was different. Day 2, I fixed the well pump, because it was making a sound that a pump makes about a week before it fails, and I'd heard that sound in Nebraska enough to know it. I knew how to address it, and I had what I needed in my saddlebags, and it took half a morning. After that, the pump ran quiet and clean. That night, Agnes made a roast that was the best thing I'd eaten in longer than I could credibly date. She did not mention the pump. She served me the same portion she served everyone else. In the first week, I also patched 3 roofs: Hattie's bakery, the building Ruth used as her office, and the south corner of the boarding house where the flashing had gone, cleared the collapsed false front off Foundry Street before the lean got worse and brought the wall down with it, and spent an afternoon in the old company stables assessing what was salvageable. Most of it was. The stalls needed work. The tack was in various states, but the bones were sound. Dot Vasquez found me in there and showed me through the forge. She knew what she had. The bellows good, the anvil solid, the tools mostly right, a few worn past use. She walked me through each piece with the particular attentiveness of someone who has been waiting to show someone what they know. "You work iron?" she asked. "Enough to assess it," I said. "Enough to get it running with someone who knows it." She considered that. My husband said enough about everything. He was usually right. I took it as offered and moved on. We made a list of what the forge needed. She kept the list herself, which was the right call. By the end of the second week, I had not had the arrangement conversation with Margaret or anyone else. I'd been too busy. And the thing about being busy in a specific place is that the place starts to become specific to you. You learn the ground. The work teaches you the place. The problem, and I held on to problem, as long as I reasonably could before accepting the wrongness of the word, was that 12 structures and 9 women and the goats and the chickens and the cold forge and the school and Ruth's economy in her ledger and Claire's medicine room all together constituted a going concern. It was not a ghost town. It was a town that had lost most of its men and had been running without them for 3 years. What it needed, what had been slowly giving way since '84, was the physical infrastructure maintenance. Not all the things that had been done. These women had kept this place alive through 2 hard winters without any of the things I was doing, and I did not make the mistake of forgetting that. But the roof corners and the pump mechanics and the forge and the outbuilding frames and the street drainage that was going to cause trouble in the spring thaw, those things had been going without someone who knew them and had the strength for the heavy versions of the work. I was 41 in reasonable condition, and as it happened, I had nothing else to do. This is how I came to be what I was at Creed's Crossing, not because anyone declared it, not because there was a conversation where Margaret or Agnes or anyone said, Well, you're the man now, take the job. Just because the work was there and I knew it and I showed up to do it, morning after morning, and the mornings accumulated. The winter came in late October, which anyone with Montana experience could have told you was not late. The first snow was 4 inches. By the time it was properly November, it was not a joke, and by December it had intentions, the kind of cold that is not merely unpleasant but is also a structural challenge to any collection of people trying to survive it. We were in reasonable condition for it. I'd spent most of September and October cutting and splitting firewood in every hour I wasn't doing structural repairs, more than I thought we'd need, which turned out to be about right. Agnes and Ruth between them had been provisioning since before I arrived, with a seriousness I recognized from quartermasters who actually cared whether their men had what they needed. Ruth's ledger showed the incoming and outgoing, and when she showed me the columns in October, she said, "We're short on lamp oil and I'm not comfortable with our salt reserve." I went to Helena before the first snow and came back with lamp oil and 50 pounds of salt and the other things on her list, and when I got back I noticed that she had updated the ledger without asking where the items went in. Pearl's goats were a source of ongoing concern and occasional comedy. They were productive, the milk, the cheese that Pearl made with a procedure she declined to fully explain on the grounds that it was complicated and people were better off not worrying about it, but they had a gift for being somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Twice I rebuilt the pen. Twice they reconsidered the rebuild and found another opinion. By December we had reached an understanding that was less of a solution and more of a mutual acknowledgement of the situation. Claire Toussaint was the winter's most important resource in a way I didn't fully appreciate until I saw her work. Nora Ellenbeck got sick in November, the kind of chest sickness that announces itself with a bad night and can go either way in the weeks after, into fever and the serious trouble or back out to recovery. Claire set up a steam tent in Nora's room and worked her for 3 days, in and out, adjusting the willow bark tea, adjusting what she burned on the stove for the steam, sitting with her at 3 in the morning when the fever was high and someone needed to be sitting. By the 4th day, Nora was complaining about the smell of what Claire was burning, which we all understood correctly as evidence of recovery. I watched Claire work during the worst of it, the things she did and how she moved through them. There was nothing uncertain in it. She knew what she was doing. "You need more supplies," I told her when it was done. "Yes," she said. "What I have is what I could get from what was available. I'll go to Helena in the spring. Give me a list." She looked at me for a moment. The particular look she had that wasn't skepticism exactly, but was waiting to see if I meant it. "All right," she said. That was how most of it worked. I'd see what was needed, I'd say I'd address it, and then I would. It sounds unremarkable. It was unremarkable. But it was the first time since before the war that my work had a direct and visible landing point I could measure. On the trail you work, and the work serves the drive, and the drive serves a profit that's not yours. In Nebraska, the work went into the ground and the weather made its own decisions. In the war, the work was breaking things. Here I fixed the pump and the pump ran clean, and everyone had good water. I hadn't known how hungry I was for that. I want to tell you about the weeks in between, the weeks that don't have a single story in them but are maybe the most accurate part. There was a week in December where it didn't get above -15 during the day and went to -30 at night. Wind off the north that came through any gap you hadn't thought to check. The kind of cold that is not an inconvenience but a condition. You organize your whole day around the management of it. What fires to run, what animals to check and how often, what routes through the buildings made sense and what routes wasted warmth. I'd been in cold before, trail winters in Wyoming. The Army, though the war theaters I saw were mostly in the South, and that cold was different, wet and mean rather than the dry, brutal cold that knows what it's doing. What I hadn't been in was cold inside a structure I was responsible for, with 9 other people depending on the structure to hold. I checked the building perimeters every morning before full light. Agnes's boarding house, the bakery, the company offices where Nora kept her school, the outbuildings. The goat pen, which Pearl worried about to a degree I came to understand, was not out of proportion. I fixed a gap in the north wall of the bakery on the 2nd day of that cold week that I'd noticed but hadn't prioritized. And when I came in from doing it, my hands weren't working right, and Hattie made me sit next to the hearth with my hands around a cup and didn't say anything, which was unusual for Hattie. The rest of that week I started carrying a second pair of gloves, which I should have been doing. What I'm trying to say about those weeks is that it wasn't dramatic. It was attentive. You show up to cold whether the same way you show up to a pump or a leaking roof. You pay attention. You identify the problem before it identifies you. You address it with what you have. The drama is in the not doing it. The doing it is just work. But there was something else in those weeks that I haven't found the right words for yet. Something about the evenings. In the evenings, we were mostly together in the common room of the boarding house, which Agnes had arranged with the practical intelligence of a woman who understood that warmth and company were the same resource in winter. Hattie would come over from the bakery after the day's baking was done. Ruth Sable would bring her ledger and work on it by the lamp. Nora Ellenbeck read. She had 6 books and read them in rotation, and occasionally read aloud when the evening called for it, which she judged with accuracy. Pearl knitted something that never seemed to be finished. Claire Toussaint made things. I didn't always know what she was making. Combinations of the dried things from her room, new preparations, and she worked with the concentration of someone for whom work and thought were the same activity. Vera Polk sat in the far corner with her coffee and her expression. Dot Vasquez mended or planned. She had a habit of drawing the forge work she was going to do, the specific shapes of what she intended to make, in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and in the evenings she drew and calculated. Margaret did the household accounts, different from Ruth's broader ledger, the specific daily accounts of the boarding house, what had been used, what was needed, what could wait. She worked with a neatness that wasn't fussiness but precision, each entry placed where it belonged. I sat with them. Some evenings I had work I could do at the table, harness to mend, an axe handle to reset small things. Some evenings I didn't, and I sat anyway because the room was warm, and there was lamplight and 9 women who knew exactly what they were doing, and something in that was restful in a way I didn't have a word for at the time. I'd spent a lot of years in the evenings of men. Camps, bunkhouses, the boarding houses of working men, which are not the same as this was. The particular atmosphere of those places, which is not bad but is specific, the flatness of men without women, the particular quality of conversation that happens when no one is tempering anything. I hadn't known I'd gotten tired of it. That room in December, with the wind working at the corners and the lamp burning and Ruth's pen on her ledger, and Hattie telling Pearl something I couldn't hear that Pearl found objectionable. That room was the first place in a long time where I sat in the evening and didn't feel the particular restlessness that had been my companion since before the war. I'm being accurate. I don't have a better word than restlessness, and I want to be accurate. The hardest thing that winter, and I've had winters with harder things in them, was the Alderton men. There were 4 brothers. They had worked the mine before the collapse and come back through in late November, moving from somewhere towards somewhere else. The kind of men the territory produced in those years. Not entirely outlaws, not exactly honest. The large gray space between defined by what opportunity presented itself. They knew Creed's Crossing. They knew it was mostly women now. They knew the property had changed hands because the probate sale had been public and they'd been in Billings around the time of it. They came on a Thursday evening. I remember because Agnes made her Thursday venison stew, which she did every Thursday, and I was in the boarding house eating it at the common table with Hattie and Ruth and Claire when I heard horses. More than one, moving at the kind of pace that's a statement. I put down my spoon. I put on my coat. I picked up my rifle from beside the door, which is where I kept it, and I went outside. 4 men on horses at the edge of Foundry Street. The eldest, who I'd learned was called Cal, was a large man with a large face, and the manner of someone accustomed to talking around a thing while meaning the exact thing he was circling. "New owner," he said. "That's right." He looked at the street, at the smoke from the chimneys. "Here it's mostly women out here." "That's right." "Cold winter coming." He said it as though he were being helpful with information. "Place like this could use some extra hands." He was not talking about hands. I had my rifle across my arm, barrel down, the position you adopt when you're not pointing it at anyone yet, but are prepared to describe the circumstances under which that changes. I let him understand the description. "I've got what I need," I said. "You're welcome to water your horses and move on." Cal looked at me, then at the town, then back at me. The calculation he was doing was not complicated. "Awful cold up north," he said. "Might be we winter nearby." "Might be," I said, This property isn't available. We held the moment. From the corner of my vision, I registered Vera Polk on the porch of the old sheriff's office, which was to the left and behind the Alderton brothers. She had her rifle, and the particular way of holding it that communicated she was neither displaying it nor pretending it wasn't there. Then Margaret came out of the boarding house behind me. She had no weapon. She came up beside me, slightly to my left, and looked at the four Alderton brothers with an expression that was the complete absence of any willingness to engage with whatever they were deciding. Cal's eyes went to her, back to me, to Vera on the porch, to the general weight of the arrangement as it stood. "Nice water," he said, after a moment that had finished its business. They watered their horses at the trough and left. I watched them until they were a mile out and the darkness had them. Then I went inside and finished the stew, which Agnes had covered and kept warm without comment. That night Margaret knocked on the door of my room, the small one at the back of the boarding house, the one I'd taken because it was furthest from the morning sounds, and I am a man who prefers a door between himself and the world while he's sleeping. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "Don't be modest, it doesn't fit you." I didn't have a useful answer. "Get some sleep," I said. "You too." She went back down the hallway. I heard her door close at the other end. I lay in that small room listening to the wind at the corner of the building, and thought about the look on Cal Alderton's face when his calculation came back with the wrong number. The feeling in my chest was something I hadn't felt in a while, not pride exactly. Satisfaction, maybe in the Latin sense, full, completed enough. I had been the thing that stood between those men and this place, and the thing that stood there had been enough. I hadn't known I needed to find that out. By February, I knew that place the way you know ground you've worked. Not in the way of roads, which you know by what's on them and how they carry you. I'd known a lot of roads, but in the way of specific knowledge acquired one task at a time. The northwest corner of the company office roof leaked when the melt came off the upper slope, because the flashing sat at an angle that fed water along the edge instead of away from it. I'd packed that corner in November with pine tar and would need to readdress it with proper flashing in the spring. The well pump worked best if you primed it slowly on mornings below 15 degrees, because the seal got stiff and forcing it caused the same where it had shown when I arrived. The south-facing kitchen garden plot that Dot and Hattie had started talking about would drain well in the spring thaw because the grade fell right. I'd watched the ice go in November and knew where the water wanted to go. Pearl's goats, the brown one with the torn left ear, was the instigator. The others followed where she went. You solved the brown one and you solved 90% of the problem. Nora Ellenbeck's classroom stove ran hot on the left side, so the children sat on the right side in cold weather and spread out in warm weather. She'd worked this out before I got there, but mentioned it when I went to look at the stovepipe, which needed cleaning. You know these things and you're not a stranger anymore. You're not even new. You're just there, embedded in the specifics, part of the machinery of how it works. I noticed this in February because it was the first time I thought I should address the company office roof flashing in March when the weather opens up, and I thought it as though it were obvious and settled. As though the question of whether I'd still be there in March had resolved itself without my being asked to vote on it. Maybe it had. Spring came the way it does in Montana, not as an arrival but as a negotiation, warm days arguing with cold ones, mud everywhere, the creek coming up fast. The thaw happened, and the northwest corner of the company office did exactly what I'd predicted it would do, and I addressed it with proper flashing and 2 days on a ladder in April air that hadn't fully decided to be April yet. I went to Helena like I'd said, 6-day round trip because I took it at a reasonable pace. Wick had his preferences about the mountain roads, and I'd learned to accommodate them within reason. Pack horse because the lists were serious, and I wasn't going to cut them short. Ruth Sable's list covered general provisions, weighted toward what they were short on from winter. Claire Towsend's list was 2 pages in her careful hand and covered things I didn't always know the name of, which she'd written in plain language alongside. Yarrow, the yellow-flowered one, for wounds. Golden seal if they have it. Also plain carbolic if the yarrow isn't available. Hattie's list was ambitious. Hattie's list was the list of a woman who had been patiently waiting for the opportunity to make the things she'd been mentally planning since October. Agnes Beaumont's list was 1 line. Dried red peppers, the long ones, not the round ones, from whatever source in Helena stocked them properly. In Helena, I spent 3 days. The first was provisions, the straightforward work of going through Ruth's list with the general store and 2 freight suppliers. The second was Claire's medicinals, which required more explanation and more searching. Helena had a druggist who was better than average for the territory and who, when I showed him Claire's list with her descriptions alongside, became genuinely interested in the problem. He had some things and pointed me toward 2 other sources for the rest. By the end of the second day, I had most of what she'd asked for and substitutes with his notes for what I couldn't get. The dried red peppers, Agnes's one line, the long ones, not the round ones, I could not find in Helena proper. The general store had round, dried peppers and something in a tin from a manufacturer that was not what Agnes meant. I asked around on the 3rd morning and found myself directed to a small trade operation on the south end of town, run by a family from Santa Fe who had been in Montana for 4 years, and who stocked the kind of goods that other stores didn't stock, because they'd come from somewhere that knew what those goods were for. They had 3 varieties of long, dried peppers. The woman who ran the front described each one to me in terms of what they were used for and how they tasted, and I listened carefully and made a judgment, and bought 2 pounds of what I was most confident about. She wrapped them in brown paper and tied it with cord. I don't know why the peppers felt important to get right. They were peppers. But Agnes had specified, and I'd said I'd get them. And the distinction between the long ones and the round ones existed for reasons that Agnes understood and I didn't. And the right thing to do was get the right ones. I find, looking back, that this was characteristic of how I understood my work there. I was not doing favors. I was doing what the place needed, and the place needed the things the women in it knew it needed, and my job was to take that knowledge seriously and act on it. Agnes knew her kitchen. Claire knew her medicine. Dot knew the forge. Ruth knew the accounts. Hattie knew bread. Pearl knew goats. Nora knew children. Vera knew security. Margaret knew all of it and held the whole shape of it together. I knew how to fix things and how to go get things and how to stand in the right place when the situation required it. That's a fair division of labor. I was content with it. Coming back over the last pass with the pack horse working hard under the weight and Wick making commentary about the grade. I came through the pines above the town and saw it from above for the first time, 12 structures laid out below. The kitchen garden showing green in the south lot, smoke from 2 chimneys, Pearl's goats in the pen, Ruth Sable's laundry on the line between the boarding house and the bakery. Specific and small and running. I tried to have some larger thought about what I was looking at. I didn't. I thought the company office roof flashing needs one more check before I can feel right about it. And then I rode down. The conversation I want to tell you about happened in June. To tell it right, I need to back up a few weeks. In May, a man came through representing a land company out of St. Paul. He was prospecting vacant and distressed properties across the territory. The kind of work the land companies were doing in those years, moving through the spaces left by failed mines and bad harvests, and the general fact that the territory was bigger than people could fill. He rode into Creed's Crossing on a Tuesday and found me on the company office roof, which I'd finally gotten to a state I felt good about, doing a final check on the new flashing. He wanted to know if the property was for sale. I told him it wasn't. He looked around at the buildings, the garden, the smoke from Hattie's chimney. "You've done some work here," he said. "We have," I said from the roof. "What's your plan for it?" I thought about that honestly. I'd been avoiding thinking about it honestly since October. "Stay," I said, "build what's here." He looked uncertain in the way of a man whose categories have failed to cover a situation. He'd ridden in expecting a ghost town and found something else and didn't have a ledger line for it. He tipped his hat and rode on. I sat on the roof for a minute in the May sun and understood that I'd meant it, not as a decision I was making in the moment, as a description of something I had already become. Margaret found me that evening on the back step of the boarding house. I was cleaning my boots, which is a task I find useful for not quite thinking about something. The sun was going off the mountains to the west in that way that makes the whole upper sky go amber and the ground go dark ahead of the light. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the step beside me. She hadn't done that before. She had a way of finding me when there was something to discuss, and she'd always managed it in passing in the course of the day. Sitting beside me on the step with coffee was deliberate. We drank the coffee. The sky did its thing above the mountains. "That man from the land company," she said. "You told him no." "I did. You're staying. Seems like. She held her cup in both hands and looked at the mountains. Pearl's goats carried on somewhere behind the bakery. The creek was down from the spring run, but you could still hear it. That first morning, she said, when you rode up Foundry Street, I came out and I thought, well, he'll get a look at what he's actually bought and be on the road by Friday. I know you did. And then you fixed the pump. The pump needed fixing. And the roofs, 3 of them in the first week. And you went to the stables and you talked to Dot about the forge and you cleared the false front. She paused. And you went to Helena and you came back with Agnes's peppers. She was specific about the long ones. Caleb, that was my name. She used it differently than the others did, not casually, not as punctuation, but with some weight behind it, as though she was referring to something definite. I want to say something and I want to say it plainly and I don't want you to answer tonight. I want you to think about it. I put down the boot I was working on. All right, I said. What you've done here for all of us this whole winter and spring, it isn't small. It isn't ordinary, you should know that. She stopped a moment. Before you came, we were managing. I want to be honest, we were managing. We'd have kept managing, I believe that. But there was a weight on this place, things going wrong slowly, things we couldn't fix, not for lack of trying, but for lack of what you have. The kind of knowing that comes from a particular life and a particular kind of attention. You saw the pump. You saw the roof corners. You knew the Alderton men and you stood there and made them understand the arithmetic. She was quiet for a moment. The amber went out of the sky. You took the weight, she said. All winter, you carried it and you didn't announce it and you didn't make a bill of it. You just did it and went to bed and got up and did it again. I said, Margaret, I'm not finished. I waited. I'm not a woman who talks easy about things like this. My husband knew that and he was patient about it, and sometimes I think I let the patience do the work that I should have done myself. She turned and looked at me directly. She had that way of looking at you that was less like being seen than like being located. Someone found the precise point where you were standing and marked it. I'm 52 years old. I've been alone 4 years. I'm not in the habit anymore of not saying things. All right, I said. You're a good man. I don't use that carefully and I mean it carefully. I've known enough of both kinds to tell the difference without much trouble. And she stopped, took a breath that was the breath of someone who has decided. I'd like to know what you want, not what you'll do, not what you're willing to manage, what you want. The mountains were dark against the last light. The creek ran. What I wanted. I was a man who had spent 20 years getting good at not wanting things that required him to stay. You learn that, after enough moving. You learn to pack your wanting the way you pack your gear, only what you can carry, nothing that weighs you down on the trail. You get efficient about it. You get so efficient you stop noticing you're doing it. And here I was with the precise knowledge of a leaking roof corner, and where the pump needed patience on cold mornings, and which goat caused the trouble, and what sound the back screen door made when the household was starting to move. Here I was with 9 women who had built something out of refusal and will, and the practical intelligence of people who had to be practical, and a woman beside me on a step who had the honesty and the nerve to ask me plainly what I wanted, when most people spend their lives avoiding that question because the asking makes the wanting real, and the reality means you can lose it. I said, I want to stay. She looked at me. I know that's not what I asked. I know it isn't. The sky had gone to the dark blue that comes before black, the long dusk of summer evenings in Montana. I want to fix the north wall of the company office before August, I said. The sill is soft, and if I let it go another winter, it'll be worse. I want to get the forge properly operational before October. Dot knows what she's doing, and the territory needs the work. It's worth something. I want to know next spring whether that south-facing slope drains the way I think it will, because if it does, we can double the kitchen garden. I looked at her. And I want to be sitting on this step, with you, if you'll have me. Margaret Hollies looked at me for a long time, not deciding. She'd made the decision before she came out with the coffee. I understood that, in the way you understand something that's been plain for a while and you've been letting yourself not quite see. She was waiting to see if I knew what I was saying. She put her hand over mine on the step, not gently, not tentatively. She placed it there with the directness of a woman who has decided and doesn't hedge her decisions, as though she were covering something she intended to keep. All right, she said. We sat there, the coffee went cold. Pearl's goats resolved whatever they'd been discussing. The creek ran on in the dark. It was the most settled I had felt in longer than I could honestly account for. I should tell you about the rest of that summer because it was the best of it in the plain, visible way. The way summer is best. Work in good weather with a clear purpose. And at the end of the day, the particular kind of tired that comes from having done real things. The company office north wall sill got done in July. New timber, properly seated, flashing rerun along the full north face while I was at it. That building is right now, and I believe will be right for a good many years. The forge came back up in August. Vasquez knew exactly what she was doing, and my job was to be the second pair of hands she needed for the heavy work, and to stand clear when she was doing the part only she knew. The bellows went first, reseated and tested. The flue cleaned and checked. By the middle of August, we had fire in the forge for the first time since 1885, and Dot stood in front of it with her hands on her hips, and an expression I had not seen on her before, something between satisfaction and vindication. Word got out the way things got out in the territory, through the network of travel and trade and men passing through who talk. Within a month we had customers, not flood numbers but real work, a rancher 40 miles southeast who needed ironwork done and knew the Creed's crossing forge had been good and now apparently was again. A freight outfit that needed repairs on a wagon axle hanger. A family building a claim house who needed hardware they couldn't get without going all the way to Helena. People came to us, to a town the territory had written off as finished. Ruth Sable updated the ledger. Nora Ellenbeck had 6 students by September. 2 families moving through had heard there was a school and made decisions about whether to move through or stop and put down a stake. They stopped, they put up a stake. The town had inhabitants it hadn't had in October of the previous year. The land company man came back in September with a better number. I told him no more briefly than I had in May. He looked at the forge smoke, the new families, the school, the kitchen garden giving its fall harvest. "You've built something here," he said. "We have," I said. That "we" was not calculated. It came out accurate and I let it stand. I want to come back to something, because I started this by saying I never told it right, and I've been working toward the telling that's right. The barkeep in Laramie got the funny version. $75, ghost town, 9 widows, bacon. He laughed in the right places. It's a good funny story. I don't begrudge it. But the funny version leaves out what the story is. The story is about a man who spent his whole adult life knowing how to move and having no knowledge at all of how to be anywhere. Who accumulated distance, the way another man accumulates land or family, or the kind of reputation that requires a place to hold it. Who had gotten so good at packing light, in all the senses, that he'd stopped noticing the lightness as a lack. Who bought a piece of ground for $75 because it was cheap and he had nowhere to be, and rode up a dirt street that was more of a suggestion and smelled bacon and got off his horse. What happened then wasn't a surprise in the sense of being sudden. It was a slow daily accumulation. The pump, the roofs. The Alderton brothers and the look on Cal's face when his arithmetic came back wrong. The trip to Helena for the peppers. The forge. The north wall. Margaret on the step with 2 cups of coffee and the particular courage of a woman who has decided to say the plain thing. By the time I told the land company man, we have. I had been someone who belonged somewhere for the better part of a year without ever marking the moment it happened. You can't mark the moment, that's the nature of it. It happens in the doing and the accumulated mornings and the specific knowledge of ground you've worked and a place you've tended. It doesn't arrive, it accretes. And then one day you say we without thinking and it's accurate. I'm getting old now, which Hattie Crane told me directly last month at the age of 79 with the particular tact she has always had for such pronouncements. Hattie is still with us, and her bread is still the best I've had anywhere, which I tell her, and she accepts the compliment with the manner of someone who already knew it. Pearl Mackenzie died in the winter of 1891. It was cold and she was 75 and she'd had a good life by her own accounting, which she gave periodically and in some detail. The goats, her goats, specifically her 4 original goats, though by then there were 7, were distributed among the households. The brown one with the torn left ear went to Vera Polk, which everyone predicted would end badly and which has on balance been a stable arrangement. Vera has opinions. The goat has opinions. They have worked something out. Agnes Beaumont is 74 and has opinions about my eating habits that she voices regularly, having apparently decided at some point that her domain of jurisdiction extended past the kitchen. She is not wrong about my eating habits. I eat what I eat, and I appreciate someone noticing. Ruth Sable's ledger is now something the county assessor has asked to consult on 2 occasions, which Ruth permitted with a controlled graciousness that communicated clearly that the request was itself an acknowledgement of what she'd been doing all along. She maintains it still. The economy it tracks is larger than it was. Vera Polk is 59 and operates on the same operating principles she operated on when I arrived. The rifle is the same rifle. The expression is the same expression. I have come to understand it not as unfriendliness, but as a high bar for what merits engagement, which I respect. Claire Toussaint over the years has trained several people in what she knows. A girl from the Blackfoot band who comes through twice a year, and who Claire speaks of in the way a craftsman speaks of a successor, with pride that is partly about the continuation. A young woman from one of the settled families who works alongside Claire now. The knowledge goes on, which matters more than I can easily say. That kind of knowing, the practical medicine of keeping people alive with what the land provides. The territory needs it and doesn't always have it. Nora Ellenbeck retired from teaching last year at the age of 69, on her own terms, and at a time of her own choosing. The young woman teaching now was one of her first students, which is as good an outcome as a school can produce. Dot Vasquez runs the forge, not helps with the forge, or handles some of the ironwork. Runs it. She hired a young man from one of the established families, and she's training him with the seriousness of someone who intends to hand something over when the time is right, and the pride of someone who understands what they're handing over. The town is not large. It is not going to become a city. The railroad went south of us, and that settled certain questions about what kind of place we'd be. We're a particular size and will stay about that size, and what we are is real and working and specific. That is not nothing. That is, I've come to understand, about as much as most things are when you look at them honestly. Margaret. I'll tell you about Margaret last because she is, in the honest accounting, the center of what my life is and has been these past years, and the end of a story is where the center goes. She runs the boarding house the way Agnes ran it in her prime, which is to say she runs it with complete attention and no sentiment, with the understanding that what a boarding house is providing the particular things that make a person feel that they are somewhere real rather than between places. She has a gift with arrivals, with people coming through, the families moving west who stop for a night, the men between jobs, the occasional someone from far away who is clearly lost in more ways than the geographical. She reads what they need and provides the version of it she has available, which is most of what they need and more than they expected to find. She is 59 now. The gray is well established in her hair, and she doesn't apologize for it, which I could have predicted from the first week. She has the voice she's always had, the one that is not loud but carries in a way that makes you understand you were expected to listen. She has opinions about most things and states them when the occasion calls, which by her reckoning is somewhat more often than by the reckoning of some others. We have disagreed on things over the years. That's honest. We've disagreed about how the stable should be organized, which I thought I knew better and turned out not to. We've disagreed about the pace at which I take on outside forge work, which she thought was too much in the years after Dot hired the boy and I felt I could carry, and she was right and I adjusted. We've disagreed about the management of one particular situation with a family who came through and whose need was more complicated than it first appeared, and in that case, we disagreed clearly and without grudge, and each understood what the other thought, and we made the decision together. That's what honest disagreement between people who know each other looks like. It's not the disagreements that tell you something. It's the manner of them. She checks on me when I've been working long, not in the way that signals worry, in the way that signals attention, which is different. She'll come to wherever I am with something that needed delivering anyway, or a question that could have waited, and she'll look at me the way you look at something you know, verifying what you know is still true. It doesn't feel like being checked on, it feels like being seen. I told her once, maybe 8 or 9 years in, it was a fall evening and the weather had been good and I'd been cutting before the winter and I was tired in the right way, the physical way. I told her I thought this was the best I'd done in my life, the most right I'd been in a place. She said, I know that. I said, I'm telling you because you're the reason. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite name, something between recognition and something more private. Then she said, "You're the reason, too." She went back inside. I sat with that for a while. That's what I mean, not a declaration, not a production of it. Just the plain acknowledgement from someone with no reason to say it except that it was true, that you were part of something that mattered and your being part of it mattered. I am the man she asked plainly what he wanted on a step in June light, when it would have been easier not to ask and simpler not to say. I am the man she put her hand over matter of fact, the way you cover something you intend to keep. That is a specific and real thing. It has weight and duration, and it gets up in the morning and eats Agnes's breakfast and does the work of the day, and comes home in the evening to a place that is, in the full and particular sense, home. I've been trying for years to say what this story is. To the barkeep in Laramie it was funny. To my cousin Dill it was implausible. To the preacher who fell asleep it was either uninteresting or too long, and he may have had a point about the length. What it actually is, what it has always been, under the $75 and the widows and the bacon and the winter, is this. A man who had spent 20 years getting efficient about not expecting anything found out, through a probate ledger and a smell of cooking on a cold morning, that he'd been wrong about what was left for him. That competence and attention and the willingness to show up every day and do the actual real work of a real place was worth something. Was seen, was chosen. That 9 women who refused to leave a place that everyone else had finished with built something that lasted, and that the thing they'd built needed something he could provide. And when he provided it, the landing was solid. That a good woman with the nerve to ask the plain question, not what are you willing to do, what do you want, was the best thing that happened to him in a life that had no shortage of things happening. That the ground you work becomes your ground, not by deed, not by the paper a lawyer signs in Billings. By the knowledge of it, the specific and daily attention to it, the mornings and the cold weeks and the fall cutting and the spring assessments and the evenings in a lit room with people who depend on what you know and what you do. That being needed, not abstractly needed, not needed in the general way of a working man or a soldier or a hand on someone else's drive, but specifically, concretely needed, for this pump and this roof and this wall and this particular passage through a November night when the Alderton brothers came through, and someone had to stand in the right place with a rifle and mean it. That being needed in that way is the thing that fills what distance leaves empty. I know what I am. That's what I want to say, and I want to say it directly because I spent a long time not knowing and didn't understand that the not knowing had a cost. I know what I am because it is evident in the ground I tend, and the buildings I maintain, and the forge that runs, and the people who have been here, and the woman who asked me plainly what I wanted and accepted the answer. I am the man of Creed's crossing Montana territory. I am Margaret Hollies' man. I am the man who got off his horse when he smelled bacon and found out that he'd ridden through a considerable quantity of ground to the right place. I own 12 structures and a working well. I paid $75 for them to a lawyer in Billings who didn't know what he was selling. 9 widows were already cooking breakfast inside. I got off my horse. That's all there is, and that's everything there is. And